Hello and welcome to GeNa. In this video, we'll be looking at creating scripts to perform spawns at runtime within our project. GeNa's API delivers simple and powerful methods that allow you to control most, if not all, aspects of GeNa's capabilities. So here we have a finished version of what we're going to be making within this video. We're going to make two spawners. One of them is going to be a town spawner that basically spawns a town wherever you place the spawner. And it looks like this. And the other is just going to be a simple tree spawner that will spawn trees in the surrounding areas around a point. We are then going to be creating two scripts. One's the runtime script, which will perform the spawn at runtime, the individual spawn. And the other is the runtime executor, which will execute each one of these spawns in a specified order depending on where you put it in your hierarchy. So in this case, I have a village spawner, which has the runtime executor attached to it. And inside of there, I've got two town spawners, which are these red spheres that I'm visualizing, along with the tree spawner, which covers the area. You'll also notice that I've put the towns first, so the towns spawn at the very start of the game, and the trees will spawn afterwards to overlay the villages. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a town game object, which has my houses, along with the fences around it and any other details that we wish to add. So I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to call this town. And I'm going to grab the transform and just place it somewhere here on my terrain. This is going to be our origin point. And I'm going to go look for the houses prefabs in my project. So I'm going to filter by type house. So we've got a few houses that we can pick from. So I'm going to pick from this one. I'm going to probably move it there. This is just around the origin. So just so that I can see my origin, I'm actually going to give it an icon. I'm going to give it just some random icon. Maybe this one might be good. I'm also going to increase the size so I can see it. There it is. So this is the origin point of where the town is going to be. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep putting in new ones. We also need to make sure that later we attach it to the game object itself. But for now, I'm just going to place the objects around. So I'm going to put another house just over here. Put this one and maybe rotate it a little bit. Make it look a bit more organic. And then put one like that. Cool. So now that we've got our three houses, I'm actually going to create an empty game object inside the town to store it. So I'm going to call it houses. And I'm going to drag all three of these into that object. So now we've got, inside of our town, we've got a bunch of houses. Next up, we're going to be putting the fences around the houses. So I'm going to call this fences. So it's an empty game object again. The difference here with fences is I'm actually going to use a spawner that comes with GeNa. So if we go inside of Gaia Pro, you'll see we have spawners, and in there we have fences. So there's one spawner in particular I want to use. So I'm going to drag it out. I'm not going to attach it because this is just going to be used to spawn fences. So I'm actually going to shift click this to make a sample, and then I'm going to control drag to start creating the fences. And this doesn't have to be perfect. I just wanted it to look good enough to place some other objects in there. So that way we can formulate our village a little bit more. I might put some just around here as well. Maybe I might delete some of these objects. Doesn't have to be there. That one I don't want. And just sort of fix it up a little bit. There we go. And you can add details if necessary. And I'm just going to grab all of the fences that are under the terrain by selecting all of them. And I'm going to drag them under our fences object we created before. So now they're a part of the town object that we're going to be spawning. So far this is looking pretty good. I'm happy with this. And you can even add some more details if you wish. I'm just going to start with these for now. So I've got houses and I've got fences. So the next step is to add decorators. Now I want the fences to snap to the ground wherever they get spawned. So to do this, I'm going to have to select all of these fences. And I'm going to add a component to this, which is called the transform decorator. And the GeNa transform decorator allows you to specify how you want this object to be positioned. So I'm going to snap it to ground. So there we go. It's going to snap each one of these to the ground. But I also want to snap the town, this root object, to the ground as well. But it should do this before it does the snapping to this, because of the order in the hierarchy. So I'm actually going to add another GeNa transform decorator to the root of the object this time. And I'm going to select snap to ground. Cool. So you could do the same thing with the houses if you wish. At the moment, I want to just do it with the fences and the root. So we can start there. Okay, so next I'm going to create a new spawner. And this spawner is going to contain a town. So right click, go GeNa, add spawner. I'm going to create a new palette. This palette is going to be called village palette. So all palettes, new ones that you create, get put under the assets folder. So that's where that is. If we go back to my spawner, here we go. So we've got our spawner ready. All you have to do is just click and drag the town object into the spawner. And this will allow us to see what settings we've set it up as. So we've got snap to ground set up because of the decorator. We've got the houses put in here, the fences. Each one of the fences are snapping to ground. So it should theoretically look like this. There we go. So all the fences are snapping to the ground. I can see that our houses are going to need to be snapping to ground as well, and with a little bit of an offset so that they stick to the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. I'm just going to go back, undo this, remove the prototype. Now let's go to the houses and attach a transform decorator to the object and snap to ground. So all three of these houses will be snapping to ground. I'll go back to the spawner and I'll reattach the prototype. Cool, so I'm happy with that. The fences are snapping to the ground, and now this is looking like a proper village. Next up is our tree spawner. So the tree spawner is fairly easy. I'm just gonna right click, go to GeNa, add spawner. So we can go create the spawners directly. I'm gonna put the village palette in there so that we can use the same palette. And I'm gonna add trees. So I might have two different types of trees. We've got the birch, we've got the other one as well. I've added to the terrain. So if you want to add different types of trees, you can just add them to your terrain and they'll show up in this drop down list. So if I go ahead and spawn this, they look like that. Fantastic. But if I wanted to change the amount, we can just go, I'm going to change the instances to about 10 by 10. I'm going to increase the throw distance, so that way it'll spread across the spawner a bit more. That looks good. I might actually increase it a little bit more, so maybe 20 by 20. Yep, that looks good. I'm also going to see if it avoids the buildings. Yes, it does. So if I spawn, it won't go on the buildings, but it'll be really close to the fences. That's okay. I don't mind about that. Okay, so essentially what should happen is when we spawn the village, this should spawn right after it on top. Okay, so we have our tree spawner. It's set up with the spawn criteria correctly. I might actually turn off check height, come to think of it, and I actually want to have the slopes set up properly. So let's see. I don't want the trees to spawn on really steep slopes. So I'm going to control shift to sample. I'm going to hold shift while I change this just to visualize what the slope limits are. So I think we can have it. No, I'm going to change this to be min max. So now we can change it to work on lower slopes. That's a lot better. So between 0 and 25 degrees. That looks good. So if we go back to our spawn, that should still work. And if we spawn along the mountain, it won't spawn on really steep slopes. Fantastic. So that's our tree spawner. Now that we have a tree spawner and our town spawner, I'm going to create a prefab out of this. I'm going to create a folder first, which is going to contain our spawners. And we're going to drag both these spawners into there. So that and this one. I'm also going to be changing the name of one of these. So this one here should just be called trees. And I've changed the prefab name as well to trees. So now we've got town and trees. Beautiful. So we've got 2 of our spawners set up, they're configured, and I'm gonna keep this template in the scene so I don't lose it. I'm just gonna disable it for now and leave it right there. So now that we have our town, we've got the spawners generated from that object. I'm now going to go ahead and create the scripts that we're going to use to spawn this at runtime. That way, every time we hit play, it'll be a totally different environment every time. So let's go ahead and click create. I'm going to create a folder called scripts. So in this, I'm going to create 2 scripts called runtime spawner and runtime executor. We're going to just start with the runtime spawner to get things working, and then we'll move on to executing them in the right order. But for now, let's go ahead and create an empty object to store this. This is going to be called runtime spawner, and we're going to position it somewhere we can see it, just there. So I'm going to attach our script to it and open it up. Okay, so this spawner is going to be in charge of using GeNa's API to perform spawns at runtime. Just to have it there. Now, the few variables we're going to need are a reference to a GeNa spawner. So this is going to be the prefab. You need to make sure that you are referencing GeNa core as well. So using GeNa core. And we're also going to call this spawner. I'm going to go public float radius. We need a radius to see how far we want this to spawn. We also want a spawn amount, which is an integer. Spawn amount. So it's going to be probably 5 by default. And just for our own readability, I'm going to have a gizmo's color. It's going to default to red for now. Okay, so for gizmos, I'm going to go void onDrawGizmos. We're going to draw a gizmos, assign the color first. So I'm going to draw a wire sphere. So the wire sphere is going to be drawing at the position of this transform and by the given radius that we have. Cool, so let's test this. Let's go back to Unity. Just to make sure the script is working, we're going to make sure that, yep, so it's actually visualizing a sphere radius, and it'll change based on what we put here. You can also change the color, so it could be whatever you want it to be. I'm going to be red at the moment. And we also have the ability to add a reference to the spawner. So the spawner we're going to reference in this one is going to be the town. So I'm going to spawn the town. I'm going to refer to this spawner. So you actually don't need to have an instance of the spawner in a scene to spawn any of the objects, because it's part of a prefab. So you're just getting the prefab to perform a spawn at any location in your scene, because it's referencing all of the information you need. So let's go back to our runtime spawner. Now we're going to create a function called void perform spawn. Now this is going to be public so that we can access this from other scripts. And the goal here is that the first thing you need to do is load the spawner. So whenever you have a reference to a spawner and you're going to use it, you need to call spawner load as the very first thing required in the API. So then we're going to loop over specified amount of times, and that's using our spawn amount. So I'm going to create a for loop, and I'm going to call this spawn amount. So we've got our spawn amount, and we're going to generate a random position and perform the spawn at that position. So the random position is going to be a vector 3. This is going to be called random position. We're going to assign it to the transforms position plus a random inside unit sphere. This is a Unity specific variable that gives you a random value. So we're going to use that and we're going to times it by a radius. So this should give us a random position within a sphere. And we're going to tell the spawner to spawn at that random position. And that's it. So that will perform a spawn using the GeNa spawner that we referenced. But before we can even test this out, I'm actually going to call perform spawn in start for now. And we're not going to use update, so we can actually just get rid of update. Cool. So this script temporarily is going to perform a spawn at runtime when we hit start. So let's go ahead back to Unity, hit play, and everything should work, and you should see that it spawns the village. It actually spawns quite a lot of them in the one place, but funny enough, it didn't actually spawn any of the other objects on top, luckily. So what we're going to do next is we're going to leave game mode. We're going to increase the radius. So this is where our villages are going to spawn. And I'm going to hit play again. Now they should be a bit more spread out. There we go. So we've got 5 different villages that have spawned in our area. Beautiful. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to rename both of them. So one of them is going to be called trees. And the other is going to be called town. Okay, so with trees, it's going to be referring to the other spawner. I'm going to change the color too so that I can recognize where it is. So I might make it green to signify these are the trees. And increase the radius. Now, the issue with spawning terrain trees is that when you spawn them, they'll spawn, but when you leave game mode, they're permanently set to the terrain. The reason is because you're modifying the terrain data when you enter game mode. So whenever you modify the terrain at runtime, it's going to be saved to the terrain data. So that's something to keep in mind. At the moment, what I'm going to be doing to test this is I'm just going to be removing them manually. I'm going to hit play and just test that again. Cool. So one thing I do want to fix is the spawn range of the trees. I don't like how they're very bunched up together. I want them to be spread out. So let's go back to our tree spawner and increase the range. And I'm also going to increase the spread, the throw distance. Cool. Now that we've increased the size, I might actually increase the instance count as well. So maybe 40 by 40. I want a lot more trees. That looks good. Okay, so when you make these changes, GeNa will ask you to save the changes of the prefab, so you will have to do this. So click Save Changes. Now the prefab will be updated to the saved changes. And we're gonna go and just hit play and see if this works. There we go. So that looks a little bit less bunched together and a bit more natural. So that means that every time we leave game mode and hit play, it'll be very unique every time. Beautiful. So it's always unique every time. They all have fences, they all have houses, and they all have terrain trees. You can also increase the amount of the tree spawn. So I might have something crazy like 50. And now when we hit play, it performs a lot more spawns along the terrain. But one of the things that is troublesome is the fact that they're going to be spawning simultaneously. There's not going to be any control over which order happens. So this is where the runtime executor comes in to fix this problem. So the runtime executor is going to be an empty game object. We're going to call it runtime executor. And I'm going to just reset the transform and drag the runtime spawners underneath. And we're going to attach the other script that we created, the runtime executor, to this object. So let's make a bit more of an edit here. I'm actually going to go back to the runtime spawner and I'm going to stop start from calling it because we're no longer going to get Unity to call this automatically. We're going to be calling this manually through the runtime executor. So the runtime executor script is not going to need system collections or generic, so I'll get rid of that. We do need the start function, but not update. So we're actually only going to need one variable, which is the runtime spawner array. We're going to call it runtime spawners. We're also going to grab all of the runtime spawners in hierarchical order. And that's really easily done by just using get components in children, which is the one down here. And we're going to get the type of runtime spawner. Cool. And then lastly, we're just going to loop over each of the runtime spawners sequentially. So for each runtime spawners, so all of the runtime spawners inside of them, we're going to go and perform this spawn. So runtime spawner dot perform spawn. And there we have it. So on start, it's going to grab all of the children inside of the runtime executor root object. It's going to loop over each one of the runtime spawners and perform the spawn manually. So that means that it should do it in order. So if we undo all these trees, I'm going to hit play. And the way we'll notice this works is if there is more houses. And indeed looks like there is more houses because the trees weren't blocking the spawns. So that looks great. Now one other thing is you can duplicate the town so that there's two separate towns on either end of the island. So you can have it go over here is going to be a town, and then over there is going to be the initial town. And you can just spread these, you can just play around with the values. I'm also going to do a second set of trees as well. So the trees will be over here instead. And they overlay a bit, but that's fine because it means that we're going to have something look a bit more organic. And I forgot to clear the trees. I'm going to clear the trees before I perform this spawn. I'm going to clear the trees before I perform the spawn. And I'm going to hit... Now let's hit play. Now we have two villages that have spawned. Two separate villages with all of the trees overlaying. Now, if you don't want the trees to go below the water, I actually turned off a setting in the spawner that allows for that, which is, if we go down to check height, we're going to get the sea level. I'm going to clear the trees, I'm going to hit play, and the trees shouldn't enter the sea level at all. So lastly, let's just say we wanted to change some of the settings inside of our spawner via script. You'd go to the code. Let's go over to the runtime spawner. You'd go to where we did the load function, and just after you want to get the GeNa spawner data values from the spawner itself. So it's spawner.spawner data. So this contains all of the data that's inside of a spawner. So the name, the type, the mode, all of this information, placement criteria, spawn prototypes. You can access all of that information via getting the spawner data. But if you change any of this data, so let's say we want to change a spawn range, you can change it yourself manually like this. But when you do change this value, you will need to go spawner.save to save the data that you've changed. So essentially it's 3 steps. You load the spawner, you modify the data, and you save the data. Now that we've done this, if you hit play, the spawn range on all of the spawners should be changed to be 100. And there we have it. That's how you perform spawns at runtime. Thanks for watching.